Hey, everyone, and welcome to the YoJoeShow podcast. Hey, Joe.
Hey, how you doing, yo?
I'm awake and alive. You with me?
Heart's beating, lungs are working. Not for those two
Yeah,
things, the rest just wouldn't matter.
exactly. I think we definitely have a lot of very interesting topics to discuss. Let's start off with the Joe Rogan episode of Douglas Murray and Dave Smith, because that's been breaking the internet and unfortunately didn't go exactly as we were hoping.
Yeah, I don't even think we have to play a clip of it. It's been so widely distributed and rehashed, and everyone's giving their 2 cents and their point of view. Maybe you want to just fill in for those that might have just somehow missed it.
Yeah, so for anybody not familiar, Douglas Murray is one of the OG war reporters, like real war reporters, who goes to every single war zone in the world, goes to the battle lines, whether it's Ukraine or Afghanistan or Iraq or Gaza, everywhere, Myanmar, Sudan. Like, he is a true journalist in the real definition of the word, in the traditional definition of the word. And he has a very good understanding of the world as it works and the different forces. Specifically, he understands how unique Western civilization is and how many forces there are trying to defeat it. So Dave Smith, for anybody unfamiliar, is originally a comedian turned talk show podcast host who is undoubtedly brilliant as well. And he is libertarian too, a very different libertarian than we are, let's just say. And he is definitely not a supporter of Israel. He believes that what's happening there is genocide, etc. The ironic part is Douglas Murray is one of the best people to respond to his criticisms and actually have the background and the knowledge to give the correct context and respond to most of his questions. I think Dana Smith's point is it's beautiful, but very unrealistic. It reminds me of, I think I may have mentioned this in one of the earlier podcasts, but Churchill mentioned about the first prime minister of India who fought against the British, Mahatma Gandhi. Well, he wasn't exactly the first prime minister of India, but Mahatma Gandhi was one of the people who fought most diligently for the freedom of India. And what Churchill said about him is Mahatma Gandhi was successful because he protested peacefully, but he was successful because he was doing so against the British Empire. If he had tried to do the same thing against the Soviet Union, he would have been long sent to Gulag and disappeared of, right? So I think Dave Smith, in theory, his points are very moral and beautiful. In practice and reality, if you understand the way the real world acts, it is just very irrelevant. Douglas knows this. Douglas has the capacity and the capabilities to give a really great explanation of it. But unfortunately, when on the number one podcast in the world, on Joe Rogan, when he had the best opportunity for that, he really failed because he went into a whole credentialism type of argument. I'm the historian, I'm the writer, I'm the researcher. And it's just not a very good argument to make. It's an argument that Douglas himself has criticized in the past when others have used. And it's not one that he typically uses. And he has the capability of responding, but for some reason, he came out swinging right on the Joe Rogan podcast. He came out attacking Joe Rogan, which, if somebody's hosting you on a podcast, it's just not it's not a nice thing to do. His criticism was correct. Joe has hosted way more people that hate Israel over the past year than people who support Israel. But the fact that he just came out swinging and he just went on an attack for the first 40 minutes, and he kept on bringing up the whole credentialism argument, which is like, why don't you respond to Dave Smith's points? And he knows the good responses, right? He could do it, but for some reason he just got derailed. I don't know exactly what caused it. And he kept on repeating the whole credentialism. I don't like it that comedians give their opinions. Oh, it's fine that you give your opinion, but you should really listen to the pros. And there is some legitimacy, a little bit of legitimacy in that argument, right? When we think that everybody has a right of speech, right? Both of us are not real specialists in anything per se, right? And yet we sit here and we give our opinions about things, right? But you always have to take more seriously people who did do the work, specifically journalists who actually went there, who actually saw it in their own eyes, who actually experienced things with their own hands. Whereas Dave Smith he's never been to the Middle East. He sits in his studio and he criticizes, right? And so Douglas's point is it's easy to criticize when you're sitting in a studio, go to a war zone and experience and feel what war is really and how shitty it is for everybody involved, just to understand a little bit what the soldiers have to put up with, the situation that's going on, how Hamas uses people as human shields, how many Islamists prefer that people die because they know Israel will get criticized for that. So they'll deliberately use their own people as human shields, deliberately store things, mosques, churches, hospitals, etc., because they want the pictures, they want the sympathy of the world. So they're really using our sense of morality, the West's sense of morality against ourselves, right? And again, Douglas is so capable. I wish to see almost like a reincarnation of this interview where Douglas stays on point and really responds to his arguments as opposed to just criticizing the man. Unfortunately, Douglas failed here. Gad Saad did a very good kind of summary of that. He criticized Douglas, and he was criticized for criticizing Douglas, which is a stupid thing, right? We all love Douglas, but when somebody makes a mistake, you got to admit it, right? Trigonometry also did a really great kind of summary of what went on and gave a few good answers. And Konstantin Kisin has a very clear view of the goods of the Western societies versus other societies, which for some reason the media and the elite tend to obfuscate.
Yeah, I'll give you some of my takeaways. I agree with everything you're saying. On the one hand, yes, it certainly adds credibility and value when someone can say, I've been there, I've seen it, I've touched it, I've looked at it. Totally makes a difference. For example, when people are talking about the US-Mexico border, I lived on the US-Mexico border for 11 years. When I moved back to Florida, a lot of the things being reported in the media were just completely wrong by the supposed professional journalists who were reporting on it, either by design, because they didn't want to discuss the truth or report the truth, or because they simply didn't know. So there is a value, and no one's saying that's not true, but there's a flip side of that. Again, as you mentioned, everyone is entitled to have open discourse and an opinion on a topic. You don't have to go and have a PhD in something to become an expert, or at least to be able to be qualified to discuss it. A heart surgeon and a cardiologist, neither or of them need to have a heart attack in order to be able to do surgery or to put in a stent or to diagnose a patient. They've never.
Probably better if they never did.
And there are OBGYNs who are men and they've never had a baby and never will, and they're delivering babies, yet they're still very competent.
They really have a deep understanding, who've read every book on the subject. That's why we're such big fans of Douglas, because he really is so smart and so educated. But yeah,
But the flip side of that is that doesn't entitle someone to go and prevent other people from giving their opinion, which you could certainly disagree with, and you can give all the reasons why they may be wrong. And I can give you one example. During the most recent COVID pandemic, there were a lot of people trying to voice things that they were seeing, and they were discounted because they said, you have to listen to the doctors, you have to listen to the scientists. In the end, much of what the experts were saying has now been found to have been incorrect. And some of the things being brought up and some of the potential things that might have saved lives were not being considered because it wasn't coming from someone that was credentialed. So again, I think we just have to take everything in totality and understand and listen. And certainly there are times where someone that isn't credentialed might convince someone that has vast educational experience or experience in a particular area of knowledge to maybe change their mind. So that whole thing was annoying. And again, he himself had been criticized in the past for the same exact thing, saying that he didn't have the experience or hadn't been present and so forth. So for him to turn around now and be holier than thou and say that no one else can have an opinion on this and no one else can say it. So that I certainly take issue with. Now, there's another side to what he was saying, and it was a caution, really almost a censorship caution, although there's a thin line between censorship and yelling fire in a crowded movie theater, right? We've discussed this in part in the past. You brought up on another episode of ours that sometimes when you have different media organizations trying to appear to be unbiased, they'll present two sides of an argument, but one of the individuals that's presenting one of the sides may be so far off the beaten path, extreme right, extreme left, whatever it is, but they're certainly not grounded in the argument. They're really an extreme opinion, and they're being presented as a fair alternate argument. And I think that's the one thing that was brought up as well. He was saying, if there's this argument that Churchill really wasn't really as great a guy as was made out to be, then, oh my God, what all hell would break loose, because if not for Churchill, what would we have? Germany might have advanced and we'd all be speaking German now. Nothing wrong with learning German, but by choice rather than by force. And ultimately, I get his point, but I don't think we can stifle commentary or opinion. And I think on platforms like the Joe Rogan Experience, ultimately, he's the moderator. He allows people to basically say what they need to say. And if there's something he doesn't think is legit, he's going to call it out. He's certainly not shy. And that's the reason that I think that's the other point in this whole debate that is important. I'm certainly not for censorship. And I think if someone's going to go and give some crazy opinion, or the opinion they're giving could somehow maybe be misinterpreted to mean something totally different, anyone else on the show could call that out and balance out what the meaning of it is. Sometimes in our words, when we're discussing something, it could be misconstrued. And certainly I get that point, but we shouldn't stifle someone's ability to voice their opinion or their point.
Yeah, but on many topics, Joe doesn't necessarily have the knowledge to fight back correctly, or he just wants to let the speaker speak and give their opinion. That's completely legitimate thing to do with an interviewer. An interesting thing to just finish the story is I saw the next episode of the Joe Rogan podcast had somebody, and I just saw the picture, and I saw it was somebody with a huge Star of David made out of diamonds. And I was like, oh, maybe he took Douglas's criticism to heart and he brought in somebody to defend Israel. So I start listening to that podcast, and I didn't complete the whole thing. I listened to most of it, though. And it turns out to be a Jewish comedian who's proudly Jewish, but they go on and they talk about comedy for the first hour and a half. And it's, at least to me, it wasn't that interesting. And then at one point, the guest brings out some pieces of paper and some graphs, and because he wants to get to Israel and wants to discuss it. And Joe Rogan starts making fun of him, and you're like, oh, wow, you came so prepared. Oh, man. And I understand he's a comedian, and Joe was wanting to play with him like a comedian, but he was like really determined. I want to do my part. I want to give some explanations, give some background about this war that's going on. And Joe was like, oh, obviously you can talk about whatever you want, but then he made fun of him every time he tried to bring it up, and they never really got into the discussion about Israel. I was hopeful seeing that he brought on a proud Jew to the next episode, but then he didn't really let him talk about. And again, he told him you can talk about whatever you want, but then he steered the conversation away, and he made fun every time he tried to bring it up. Now, I understand that's a comedian. He's not somebody coming to argue for Israel, but he heard some arguments, maybe in the previous episodes, maybe in others. He wanted to give some additional context. And at least the feeling I got from watching it was that Joe didn't really give him that space. He told him he could, but then he also made fun of him and moved the conversation out to more funny subject. And yes, I tend to choose the Joe Rogan podcasts that are interesting to me about science, technology, geopolitics, and stuff like that. Others choose episodes about comedians because they want to laugh, right? So maybe it was something like that, but it just felt like another missed opportunity. This time, not on Douglas's side, but this time on Joe's side.
And again, none of us are perfect. And the good thing is, all podcasters have the opportunity to move the needle in one direction or another to try to get to the proper balance. And you can't take one episode or one event and say that's the world's coming to an end. You have to look at the overall picture. I don't think that Joe Rogan's trying to push a specific narrative. Clearly, he has an interest in putting people on there that are interesting. And as you pointed out, he's not necessarily an expert on any of these topics that are being discussed. He's not a dumb guy. He's very successful. He knows what's
He has a
going on.
remarkable memory.
The bottom line is we can't pigeonhole an argument or a discussion to only the people who are academics or that are subject matter experts. Bottom line is, I think the most important discussions include the discussions that the person on the street can have with their neighbor and be able to advance their understanding of it. So I think that's the value. I think ultimately the world won't come to an end. And yes, there'll be an opportunity for people to kind of continue the discussion and broaden it and so forth. I also don't think that we need to completely attack someone that maybe on one particular day it really maybe was just so focused on trying to make a point that many people certainly took issue with it. And I think that he derailed much of what he could have or should have been talking about. But again, it's how it played out, and that's all fine. I don't think it's going to change anything in the long run. And I think everyone will have an opportunity to go back and keep discussing and keep advancing whatever narratives everybody wants to particularly discuss. One of the other things you and I were talking about have to do with relating to this whole idea of experts talking on a topic and information being given out that might cause people to completely misunderstand or that it's going to create a bias. There was that Guardian article.
Yes. Wow. Yeah, that really slapped me across the face. Now, it's not surprising. Guardian has been very vocal in their hatred towards Israel, or at least you can try and say their hatred toward the way Israel is acting in this war, maybe, but not really. It really is just hatred toward Israel, in my personal opinion. This article is a very good example of it. They had I think, a Palestinian writer, definitely an Arab writer, along with somebody else, write an article trying to find the forgotten history of the Palestinian people. Now, for people unfamiliar, the concept of Palestinian people. So after the Jews lived in the land and they had the first temple and the second temple, after the Romans destroyed the second temple, there were still many Jews living in the land until the Bar Kokhba revolt. And during that revolt, the Romans squashed the Jews trying to fight for their autonomy again. And that's when they really dispersed most of the Jews that lived in the land of Israel. I think it was Emperor Adrianus or something, in order to punish the Jews and to distance them from their homeland, he decided to change the name of the land from Judah and Israel, which were the two parts were named, to Palestine. And the reason he chose that name was because in the Bible, Israel's ancient enemies are the Philistine people. The Philistine people have nothing to do, even though they lived around where Gaza is now, in Ashkelon and Ashdod, which are currently in Israel. So even though they lived around that same area of Gaza, no relationship to the Palestinians we now consider Palestinians. They were seafaring people who came and were pretty strong and settled there, likely Greek. And there were historical enemies of the Jewish people, lots of biblical wars between the Jews and the Philistines, specifically noting Samson, the mighty Samson, etc. So the Romans, in order to piss the Jews off, renamed the land Palestine. Then it was part of the Byzantine Empire, which converted to Christianity until the Islam kind of spread out of Arabia. That was almost 700 years later, right? 700 years more or less after the destruction of the Second Temple, Muhammad came around and he started this religion of conquest, and they started fighting they conquered first all of Arabia, and then most of the Levant, and then all of Northern Africa. And even though most of the area was Byzantine, which was Christian, they forcefully converted them to Islam. The Jews, obviously, in Israel, or whoever they could, tried to forcefully convert them as well. Again, most of the Jews had left, but there were small Jewish communities. And obviously in Iran, the Zoroastrians were ruling, and they were completely defeated by Islam. So Islam is the original conqueror and illegal holder of the land, if you would like to say that. Now, again, there are always people before other people, but the concept that any of these Arabs who came out of Arabia hundreds of years and later thousands of years after Judaism, and the claim that they are the original Palestinians and they are the original people to the land is just ludicrous. So this Guardian article really had to suck at straws to try and find proof that Palestine is Palestinian, because the modern concept of what we consider nowadays Palestinian people, that was created by the KGB in order to create distrust and fight and keep the U.S. occupied in the Middle East. This article, the picture we have right now, this is from an Umayyad desert temple, but this is not the original image the Guardian article had, because the original image the Guardian article had proving that Palestine is historically Muslim Palestinian is a picture of a synagogue. Surprise. An ancient synagogue from the Second Temple period, before Islam existed, before Muhammad was born. So before Islam was ever invented, before the Arabs ever left Arabia. So that's the original picture. Do you have that one as well?
I'll pull it up in a second. And for anyone who is just listening to the podcast on an audio platform that isn't seeing the image that's up, this is from The Guardian. The article is entitled "Forgotten: Searching for Palestine's Hidden Places and Lost Memorials Review. Existence is Resistance." And again, the image that's on, basically, the reason this started a discussion between both of us was that the original image was incorrect. And I will go and switch the images so we can actually show the one that was there. Somewhere, obviously, they were notified that what they had posted was not matching with what they were trying to argue. In fact, it didn't help their argument very much. I'm going to take this one.
Yeah, and actually in the article, they brought another location as well, Gibeon, which they mentioned as a historically Palestinian place. It was a Canaanite place. I think it's the same Gibeon from the story of Joshua, where Joshua in the Bible said the sun should halt in Gibeon to win a war. But where we definitely have archaeological and historical evidence for it is King Saul, which was the predecessor who came before King David and tried to kill him. King Saul, which was a Jewish king, conquered Gibeon and he turned it into his capital, or he had a palace there. And we've actually found a lot of archaeological history of his palace and of other Jewish history in Gibeon, including ancient wine vessels that have ancient Hebrew on it and stuff like that. So basically, every single one of their arguments that they're using, trying to prove that Palestine is some Islamic Palestinian land, is Jewish archaeology. And to be honest, growing up in Israel, I got to see this a lot. My mother used to like to take us occasionally to prophets' burial sites. And every time we used to go to biblical prophets' burial sites, there would be a mosque there. And we would be like, why is there always a mosque? These are like Jewish prophets, right? So it turns out that Islam, in order for Muhammad to get legitimacy, he had to, somebody coming around just inventing a religion, everybody's like, who are you and why are you saying these things, right? So he claimed that he was the last prophet, a continuation of the Jewish prophets and then the Christian prophets. So that's why Islam believes that all of the biblical prophets are true prophets, right? So they believe in Moses technically, they believe in Jesus technically, but all of their focus is on the final prophet, which is Muhammad according to them. But they also claim that the ancient Jews of the Bible's time have basically went extinct because they all converted to Islam. So many Muslims will tell you that Banu Israel, which is the Bnei Israel, the children of Israel, which is the Jewish people's historical biblical name, that they went extinct. And the crazy conspiracy theory that many Muslims believe in is that the current Jews have nothing to do with the historical biblical Jews, nothing at all. And there are European Jews who came from the Khuzari Empire. The Khuzari was a very interesting case scenario of an empire between the Byzantine, which was very Christian, and the Muslim Empire, who wouldn't get along. And since the Jews religiously were halfway in between, and politically at that time they were halfway in between, there was an empire of Khuzar, and there's an ancient book called the Khuzari book, where basically the king at the time said, okay, they were idol worshippers, and he decided to believe in monotheism. So he said, okay, let's choose which of the three religions we should follow. He brought a priest, and he brought a rabbi, and he brought an imam, and then he had them debating, and he had the thousands of people, lots of the population listened in. And basically, at the end, the king was convinced that Judaism is true, so he ended up converting to Judaism. And there was, for a few hundred years, a Jewish empire in the middle of what is now like Georgia, Kazakhstan, that type of area. Very interesting story. They were defeated by the Mongols eventually, and I think by the Russian Empire as well, as Russia started to expand and become a country. And so they ended up disappearing. So what many Muslims nowadays believe is that current Jews have no relation to historical Jews, even though DNA evidence shows the exact contrary. But they will tell you that all modern day Jews really come from this Khuzari converts. So therefore, they're not real Jews. They're not the true descendants of Israel. And therefore, they're European colonizers who are coming to colonize the Middle East, as opposed to Jews who are coming back to their promised land. So it's a little bit of a crazy conspiracy theory, but it is extremely common in Islam, because admitting that the Jews survived and didn't all convert to Islam doesn't look very good either. And then admitting that the true Jews came back to the Middle East and then rebuilt their country, and it's successful, and it's a democracy, and it's thriving, and everybody has rights, and people are happy. And even the Arabs, they're like living there many times, versus all of the other Arab countries around, which are, if they are not oil-rich emirates, are usually in a constant state of civil war, and women and minorities never have any rights. It just doesn't look very good that 7 Arab countries tried to defeat the Jews when they were really weak and failed. And then they tried again, 6 countries, and then they tried again, right? Like 7 different wars. And then, okay, traditional army can't defeat Israel. Maybe terrorism could, and terrorism, they've been trying terrorism for many years, and that has failed. So the fact that Jews are successful in their ancient homeland in the Middle East kind of proves the biblical point, if people want to believe that. But at least to many Muslims, to which the concept of Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Harb, to translate the House of Islam and the House of Swords. All lands are divided into 2 categories. Either it's land that is currently controlled by Muslims or has been controlled by Muslims in the past, and therefore will forever remain Muslim land. And then the rest of the world, which isn't Muslim land, is Dar al-Harb, the land of the sword, is basically a war zone. So you get offended that they blow up a bus in Madrid, but Madrid is a war zone. And specifically, Spain used to be part of Dar al-Islam during the first expansion of Islam. Muslims Islamists are even more determined to claim that that is part of their homeland. So, yeah, this is the original picture that was in the article. Interesting to note, existence is resistance. It may sound peaceful, but resistance when it comes to the Middle East tends to never be peaceful. But yeah, that's the picture of the ancient synagogue from the Second Temple period.
Which is a little ironic because it goes counter to the argument that they were trying to make in the article. And then the other thing is, despite what anyone's opinion of the historical truths are, but it basically is an interesting corollary to what we were discussing before. And that's when you have experts who are obviously choosing the photographs they're going to include, and they botch that up so miserably that it makes the counter argument of who was there first somewhat a little more plausible. You have to then question this whole thing about trusting the science and trusting the experts. I would always say, listen to the experts, but trust nothing without checking and double checking and asking for a second or third opinion. And even in journalism, we can count this as a mistake. We're not saying it absolutely had to be an intentional error on someone's part because it certainly didn't help them. They were trying to find a photograph that they could include, and they just didn't include the correct one. But
Supposedly, it wasn't just like a photograph from the internet. Supposedly, they had a delegation and they went out there and they took these photos. It turns out that this photo was actually taken by an Israeli who was there. So this wasn't from their delegation, but supposedly they did have a delegation to go and investigate the historical
right,
sites. So
right.
this was supposed to be real journalism, but when it comes from the Guardian, you can never take it seriously.
It's just interesting how they had one photograph and then suddenly the photograph changed with no real.
One other location that they described in the article has endless amounts of Jewish archaeology and not much historical Muslim archaeology. Definitely not Palestinian archaeology because there never was a Palestinian state. Now, there were Arabs who lived in the Middle East and they were typically called Arabs. Yeah, I think our next article, our next subject is even more dismaying because during World War One, Jews were prosecuted a decent amount. Obviously, not like World War II, but at the time, there was a Jewish study group that moved. They tried to get out of the war zone and they ended up going to China. And they ended up living in China in Shanghai. And there was a successful yeshiva, which is like a Talmudic study group and like a rabbinical ordination school, etc. And they survived there through World War II. Obviously, being under the Japanese was not very nice at all. And if anybody heard the stories of the rape of Nanking and the thing that went on there, it was very brutal to everybody involved, but at least they were out of the reach of the Nazis. Supposedly the Nazis did request these Jews to be brought back and sent to the gas chambers, and the Japanese were like, just leave them alone. So thankfully those Jews were able to survive. So historically, the Far East had much less anti-Semitism than Europe, right? Or Northern Africa, etc., Arabia. But we just found a piece of Chinese Nazi propaganda. And I never believed I would be saying these words because how does that even make sense? So this is a Chinese video describing World War II. And yeah, it is basically just pure up Nazi propaganda. The video we're showing is from a YouTube channel called The Easy Way. He also has, his name is Doron. He's brilliant. He's a philosopher. So he looks at things very objectively and very zoom out. So he's very interesting to watch. He discusses a lot of very interesting things. He understands Arabic. He does some interesting content on that subject. Most of the content he does is on his Hebrew channels. The Easy Way is his English channel. But this video about the Nazi propaganda Chinese edition is freaking bonkers. He does a great job taking it apart and trying to understand where they're even coming from and explaining what's going on. The most ironic part is the vast majority of clips. So do you want to summarize it, Joe?
Sure. So again, for those not on a platform that shows the video, what is playing is, think of a Nazi Germany era. If you wouldn't know and weren't reading the Chinese, or that's been translated on the screen, it basically is explaining from the perspective of the Chinese authors of the text in the movie, ultimately that the Jews were basically not cooperating, not working with the Germans, were not helpful, and they portray the Jews as it says right in the text I'm reading now, hateful Jews. And it looks like something out of a KKK rally, frankly. I mean, that, or an educational video if you're going to join a current neo-Nazi organization, it would seem like they would be playing this. It is rather shocking that China, or at least someone or a faction within China, is openly promoting the idea of anti-Semitism and encouraging it. It's shocking to even see this in this day.
Yeah, and just to summarize the weird theory that they have, basically the story is that there were Jews in Germany, and Jews tend to be smart and educated, and therefore they were tended to be a little bit more successful. When World War I came out, they started fighting kind of opposite sides, and they were funding both sides. There was a little truth to that in terms of like the Rothschild bank loaning to both sides, but they tried to make this out that all the Jews became filthy rich while all the Germans were poor and couldn't afford any food, but the Jews were so rich and they wouldn't even listen and they wouldn't even care, and they just had all the money and all the food, and the Germans were suffering. The ironic thing is that the clips that they use in this Chinese propaganda film are mostly from Western Nazi movies. And most of the videos where they put showing how the German people were suffering by the evil Jews are actually videos of Jews, of Germans torturing the Jews. So they really just flip things over, reminiscent of the previous article we were mentioning, right? So they take videos of Jews suffering, of Jews being beaten up, Jews being tortured, Jews going hungry, and then claim that somehow this was the German people. And now anybody who's familiar with the history, the reparations after World War I were extremely harsh, and hyperinflation went rampant in Germany, and people couldn't afford any food. Obviously, the ones who suffer most typically are the minorities, including the Jews, especially when there's so much anti-Semitism and they were being robbed and tortured and stuff like that. But yeah, just the concept that, and then they claim that because of that kind of explains all the Nazis' actions, and therefore the Nazis, it's legitimate because the Jews were so evil and were so rich and were just torturing everybody else. Yeah, it's obviously ridiculous, but I'm just surprised. Nothing comes out of China without the Chinese CCP approving. Every organization, every company there has CCP representatives. So this is the CCP pushing Nazi propaganda, and that is new to me. We have seen this red-green alliance where Islam is typically associated with the color of green. It's considered a holy color a little bit. And then communism, which is associated with red, they are aligned at fighting Western civilization and anti-Semitism in Israel, etc. It's a little ironic because the green will chew up and spit out the reds if they just get the chance. So it's really just a union of convenience, but the Islamists do want to conquer the world and convert everybody to Muslim, and that includes the Chinese. It includes the communists, who are worse than, theoretically, according to Islam, worse than Jews or Christians because they're atheists, and which means that they don't believe in God at all. Yeah, this is not a true friendship between the green and the reds, but it is a partnership of convenience, and they have been going on this partnership for a very long time. Like you said, since the 70s, when the KGB invented the concept of Palestine, and they took Yasser Arafat out of Egypt and convinced him to become this Palestinian leader. And it's continuing till today, even though they really don't like each other.
Yeah, it's again, I guess one of the things to consider that would maybe make this not seem that shocking, that there's at least some people within China that are trying to push this anti-Jewish slash, by extension, anti-Israel narrative. If you think about all the funding that's going on between China and the Ivy League colleges in the United States, you start wondering then why there's so many protests, really anti-Israel protests that are going on. The two things would seem to be connected.
Well,
Because
Qatar funds them as well, and Qatar is a part of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is very radical Islamist.
right,
Hamas is part of the Muslim Brotherhood. Al Qaeda is part of the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Emir of Qatar is proud member of the Muslim Brotherhood, and he basically said he'll devote all of the resources of the country to forward the Muslim Brotherhood narrative, and that's why he created Al Jazeera, which has been extremely successful at pushing the Muslim Brotherhood propaganda. So it's definitely
well, and
scary.
clearly it's concerning ultimately to disparage anyone who's Jewish by having the nerve to go and put together a movie or some twisted documentary that seems to justify the Holocaust. Is just, again, I can't believe this is 2025 and that we're even seeing this, other than in some back room of some cult-like group, but not coming out of China. But that being said, I think the point that's made, China and other countries have an interest sometimes in at least stirring the pot and wanting to provide an extreme view, if nothing else, to just enrage people because it could clearly get them upset. And they want to throw this out there and see what happens. It's almost like they're baiting a dogfight, trying to see what to get out of it. And then there's other groups that are openly, even here in the United States, are openly calling for the downfall of the United States, not just Israel, but the
Yeah,
United States as well.
it's crazy. And while you get that pulled up, you mentioned earlier how China is sponsoring in US colleges and stuff. There was a recent article explaining that the CCP has basically funding and arming the Houthi rebels in Iran. So, sorry, in Yemen. Obviously, aside from Iran giving them intelligence and sending them most of the weapons, a lot of their drone parts and rocket parts are coming from China. And they're using that to attack Israel as well. But supposedly, Israel and China are friends, right? So, friends like that, who needs enemies? Let's go ahead and
Yeah.
talk about friends like that, who needs enemies. This is right here in the US, in Dearborn,
Yeah.
Michigan, and it is scary.
Yeah. Dearborn. This was March 19th, I think.
Inshallah, they will fall. And my message to the people of Gaza and the oppressed peoples across the world is that there are people here, both young and old, who are going to be willing to fight and are willing to put their lives and everything they can on the line to bring these empires down, because they must come down.
Yeah, memory is phenomenal. They basically just translate a lot of Arab content into English for the world to understand and see. Yeah, the American empire must fall. We will dedicate our lives and we are willing to die for the American empire to fall. These are refugees who claim that they are running away from a war zone and they have to come to America because it's safe here, but they want to turn America into a war zone, right? It's ironic. These are basically domestic terrorists. Yeah. And it's really scary, the fact that there are so many and how popular they are. We've seen a lot of these university protests that many of the protesters are not actually university students. They tend to be just local Islamists who live nearby and will use the opportunity to occupy the university to put pressure on Israel. Thankfully, the Trump administration is fighting that now. I guess some would say controversially, but they may make some mistakes. And obviously, you don't want to arrest somebody for their right to free speech. But again, if they're not American, do they have a right to free speech? If they're coming and they're promoting terrorism, is that incitement to violence? If they came, and at least what Marco Rubio would say is if on their visa application, they said, hey, one of the things I want to do in the US is spread the hatred of the West and spread the downfall of America, then they would not be approved to enter the United States. And therefore, if they are here on a green card, they should be removed. Yeah, it's just scary when we let enemy invaders come into our country. Some will say, oh, yes, but the Americans really have been killing them for so long. It's really the Americans' fault, etc. And to them, I would say, where have you been for the last 1,500 years? It is a religion of conquest who was successful due to their conquest. People believed in Muhammad because of he was so successful in his conquest. So the concept of conquering lands and people and forcefully converting them to Islam is the basis of many aspects of the religion. So it's just being aware of what's happening is very important, especially when many people are keen to blame the West for what they do to try and defend themselves from terrorists who will strap a suicide vest and blow themselves up in order to die, because that gets them closer to meeting their 72 virgins. And some would say they actually have to die many times. So they believe that they will commit suicide and die and then come back again and then grow up again and then die again for Allah. And they have to do this repeatedly, die for Allah multiple times in order to go to heaven. It is at least the radical versions of the religion, which are very common, are unfortunately are just very incompatible with the West. And we can, on a personal level, I know many Muslim friends in the IDF. I served with Muslims. I served when I was serving in ambulance in Israel. I was in a mixed Arab and Jewish town. So I served with many Muslims and many Arabs. And on a personal level, they're wonderful people, very nice people, the very best hosting in the world. They treat guests better than anybody else. In general, is Muslim cultures, and the food is delicious and the people are amazing and people are friendly and very nice. But as an ideology, it is an ideology that is completely incompatible with Western values. And the more people we bring in from countries that have ideologies that don't work with ours, regardless of where they are, even if it's Venezuela, criminals, let's say, because we know many very good Venezuelan Americans, but Venezuelan criminals, right? Or anybody else who comes with an ideology that is not compatible with the West should not be allowed, because otherwise they will replace us. When they say that they will It's exactly what they're doing. And when we see in the European Union ships bringing in, we were seeing this for years, tens of thousands of refugees. And you're like, okay, refugees should be women and children running away from war. How come all I'm seeing is thousands and thousands of aged males? Like, how are they refugees? This is crazy. And they're just brought in by the millions into Europe. This is scary because there is no way the culture of Europe will not change. Elon Musk recently mentioned what identifies a nation is its people. If you replace all of its people, it will no longer be a nation. Europe has been suffering with chronically low reproduction rate. So they're not having any children. And instead, they're bringing in Muslims who on average will have 7, 8, 10, 12 children. And within 20, 30 years, they will be the majority. We've seen videos of people in England and in Sweden trying to walk around the street, and the street is filled with Islamists or Muslims bowing down and praying. And the guy says, hey, you have a mosque right over there, and there's another mosque right over there, and there's another mosque over here. Why are you blocking the road to pray? And they just get up and they say, this is our country. Like, you think that this is your country, but this is our country. You have 0 to 1 children. We have 8 to 10 children. We are going to be the majority soon, and we will inflict Sharia law, whether you like it or not. So unless the West waked up soon, unfortunately, in many parts of the West, this can happen. And like we said, Islam has been conquering for its entire existence. They tried to conquer Europe the first time. They conquered Northern Africa into Portugal, Spain. That was during the golden age of Islam. And half of France, people don't realize, but half of France is currently Dar al-Islam, the house of Islam, according to Muslims, even though it was taken back by the Christian, what's the word I'm looking for? The Crusades. And then during the second expansion of Islam under the Ottoman Empire, they conquered all of the Balkans, so what nowadays is Albania and kind of Bulgaria and that area. And they were so successful, they were able to get all the way to Vienna, Austria, before the Polish came to Austria and saved the Austrians. But Islam almost conquered, the Ottoman Empire almost conquered Vienna, Austria. So people don't realize this is the third wave, and they realize that the best way of defeating the West is using democracy. Because if they come and they become the majority, then they'll be able to change laws and change rules and implement Sharia law. Yeah, civilization must wake up before it's too late. And again, Douglas is one of the most brilliant people on this subject. So is Gadsad, and so are many others. So yeah, any thoughts?
Yeah, my main thought is, if you're immigrating to a country, you shouldn't be going there to change that country. You're leaving where you're at because you choose to go somewhere else. You should be able to embrace the values that country has. And the concern always is when you have large numbers of people that are moving, just like we had through our southern border here in the United States, millions and millions of individuals were coming through. There is going to be a consequence. And especially if the individuals coming aren't intent on embracing all that is and that has made America be what it is. The other thing that's concerning is when younger individuals are being educated to hate America, think America's a bad place, and that all the things that supposedly made it a great place were false. And I think we have at least a generation of people now that are starting to believe that, and that are openly thinking that the United States isn't as great a country as it should be. I think that's really sad, and it opens the door to essentially a really bad and dark path that can be taken. The other point as well is that the things that happen in the extremes of some of these other countries, as you were mentioning, is problematic, but it's made worse because countries like China perhaps embrace that. They want the United States to be destabilized. As I think we would probably touch upon this on another episode, again, is the massive amounts of funding, as you just mentioned earlier, to U.S. colleges. Ivy League universities are receiving massive funding from essentially organizations that are controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. And with all that money coming in, they get a say in what happens with the curriculum and what's going on in these universities. And if that twisted anti-Semitic video was an example, there may be an interest to just destabilize the United States by using some of that propaganda, while at the same time wanting to make sure that they have full access to our colleges. And one of the things we touched upon was this post that we saw, this social media post regarding Xi Jinping's daughter being in the United States.
So this is a little old. The article from it is back from 2022. I doubt it's still the case after Huawei, the Chinese electronics company, their CEO was arrested in Canada for violating, I think they were shipping things to Iran or something. So I very much doubt that she's still in the United States, but just the fact that the communist leaders themselves send their children to our universities is surprising. Yeah. And the crazy thing is, I don't even think that they have to request a say in the content very much. Just by the fact that they're funding it, just by the fact that the professors in these universities are radical communists on average, anyways, they may be more radical than the CCP themselves at times. Yeah, this was just surprising. But I was very much aware that Vladimir Putin's two daughters one lives in Germany, and I think the other is in like Sweden or somewhere else in the West. And obviously, we know that Kim Jong-un went to university and school in Switzerland. So it's not a new thing that world leaders send their children to the most prestigious schools in the world, which tend to be in the West. But the fact that Xi Jinping's only daughter was in the United States in university is very surprising. And supposedly she had Chinese bodyguards protecting her wherever she went. And that is like the Chinese military operating on US soil. I'm sure she had some diplomatic cover, but yeah, the whole concept is a little crazy to think of.
Yeah, and we're referring to an article in the Business Standard dated February 21st, 2022, that says Xi Jinping's daughter essentially was living in the United States, and the US Senator Hartzler was basically looking at what things could be done about it. And there's been social media posts about this. The reality is that, again, as you were saying, so it's not uncommon to have leaders of different countries send their kids to study abroad. It's just that if we're in a ideological battle with a country, you certainly want to limit their influence on our educational system. That's probably the most important point.
Yeah, and it is also very ironic that they espouse communism forcefully to the people within China, but then send their own children to live in Canada or the United States or some other Western country. It's like they almost know that it's fake and it's a lie, but they force it on everybody else. Again, if people had the freedom to choose, chances they would choose communism are very low. Even though the CCP isn't that historically communist, kind of adopted many aspects of capitalism, which is when they joined the World Trade Organization, when we started to see their economy booming. So even accepting aspects of capitalism will help the economy boom. But yeah, it's just very ironic and very duplicitous of them to preach, but not practice what they preach.
Yeah, and we've had times in our history where we've had concerns about other countries coming and trying to change things from within, changing the way that Americans think about America. There was the famous, I guess, well distributed and viewed video of former KGB spy in 1984 who basically laid out how the former USSR was planning on essentially subverting and taking over the United States bit by bit, slowly, but from the inside out.
When the Soviet Union failed to defeat the United States in military matters and technological matters, they decided to use our open-minded society to fight us. There are many good videos of Uri Alexandrovich Bezmenov, which is this KGB officer, kind of explaining the different tactics the KGB used to influence the population in the United States and how effective it was, including causing the end of the Vietnam War and other things. Whether correct or not, the fact that this was influenced dramatically by the KGB is not a very good thing. But here's a short clip of Yuri describing some very relevant things to our current discussion.
Mean by it. Ideological subversion is the slow process which we call either ideological subversion or active measures, активные мероприятия in the language of the KGB, or psychological warfare. What it basically means is to change the perception of reality of every American to such an extent that despite of the abundance of information, no one is able to come to sensible conclusions in the interests of defending themselves, their families, their community, and their country. It's a great brainwashing process which goes very slow, and it's divided in 4 basic stages. The first one being demoralization. It takes from 15 to 20 years to demoralize a nation. Why that many years? Because this is the minimum number of years which requires to educate one generation of students in the country of your enemy, exposed to the ideology of the enemy. In other words, Marxism-Leninism ideology is being pumped into the soft heads of at least 3 generations of American students without being challenged or counterbalanced by the basic values of Americanism, American patriotism. The demoralization process in the United States is basically completed already. For the last 25 years, actually it's overfulfilled, because demoralization now reaches such areas where previously not even Comrade Andropov and all his experts would even dream of such a tremendous success. Most of it is done by Americans to Americans, thanks to lack of moral standards. As I mentioned before, exposure to true information does not matter anymore. A person who was demoralized is unable to assess true information. The facts tell nothing to him. Even if I shower him with information, with authentic proof, with documents, with pictures, even if I take him by force to the Soviet Union and show him concentration camp, he will refuse to believe it until he is going to receive a kick in his fat bottom. When a military boot crashes his balls, then he will understand, but not before that. That's the tragic of the situation of demoralization.
Truly wonderful. It's exactly what we've been seeing going on in American universities. The key word he uses, demoralization, right? When you cause people to no longer believe in themselves, to no longer believe in an optimistic future, to no longer be optimistic, to be demoralized, to be depressed, to be unexcited. A lot of depression. We've seen depression rates all across the United States skyrocket, etc. When you grow up being told that we are evil because we are a nation of slave owners, and nobody points out that every nation was a nation of slave owners. We are one of the only nations that abolished slavery, and that's what makes us special. It's not the fact that we had slavery. Every country had slavery. Every human alive today is both descendants of slaves and is descendants of slave owners. Every human alive today.
I think you
But
could probably recount a story of the Jewish people being slaves for quite a long time.
Yeah.
It's not isolated to one group of individuals. I think when we think in the United States of slavery, think of one thing, but it was exceedingly widespread. And I think the part of the conversation that almost always seems to be forgotten is countries like Great Britain, the United Kingdom, the United States, obviously did at their own, not always the easy thing, but to change the tide for the correct way to move forward, despite the fact that the countries are still trying very hard to maintain the status quo. And again, it's not an easy history to look at and to understand, but I think it's important that we always understand the good, the bad, and the ugly of all of our history to make sure we can know where we are today is to know where we've come from. And I think that's an important consideration. But to hear a former KGB spy or agent talking in this manner doesn't seem surprising. Again, this has been around for quite a while. This was originally an interview from 1984 again, I believe. So it's been quite some time, but don't think for a moment that these type of things aren't happening and that countries aren't trying to change the perspective of the people within a country. Just like the story of the Trojan horse. It's better to fight once you're in the country than to try to fight through the castle walls from the outside. Here we are. Anyone that studies war or battle will understand there's ever a way in. You want to get in. And propaganda takes many forms. Some of it's more hardcore and is designed for a takeover of a country and its ideology. Other things are much softer. We've seen a lot of things being posted now by essentially under the guide and the direction, I'm sure, of the CCP in China regarding our current situation with tariffs with that country. TikTok videos, Instagram, just basically trying to undermine what's being attempted here and what we're doing to try to level the playing field. And they're trying to paint a picture. We have, I think, a clip that we can share that gives an example of the many clips that flooded social media to give the Chinese version of what they want us to believe reality is.
But while you get that pulled up, let me just finish the discussion. The most ironic thing about slavery is that the term slavery comes from the word Slavs. And that's because in ancient times, the most common slaves were white slaves Slavic people who came from Russia, Ukraine, etc. And the slave traders were mostly Muslims. So they would go all the way there and trade slaves and mostly sexual slaves, a lot of sexual slaves, but bring slaves to service during a lot of the golden age of Islam was propped up on a lot of slavery, specifically slavery that came from the Slavs. So the fact that anybody who's white is now evil of being a slave owner, when the term slave comes from white slaves, and when the United Kingdom would actively embargo countries who would not abolish slavery. They forced most of the world to abolish slavery. And now we are made in British and American schools to be ashamed that we are American, to be ashamed that we are British, to ignore the fact that we are one of the only countries, one of the only societies in all of human history that abolished slavery, and instead just reminisce on the fact that because there were slaves, it means that anybody who is light-skinned is currently evil, and anybody who is dark-skinned is therefore on some higher level. The whole woke ideology, the way they list the privileges of different people, is completely ludicrous, and thankfully that is disappearing. But I just think that it's very ironic that anybody who mentions that Muslims were slave owners was canceled, and anybody who mentioned that slaves were originally white, not originally, there were always slaves everywhere, but the term slavery comes from white slaves is very funny. Obviously, not to undercount the suffering of the African slave trade, which was horrific, which was completely horrific. And the way slaves were treated everywhere in the world, including in the United States, is not good. But what we should focus on, what identifies us, is the fact that we are one of the only nations that stood up to stop that. But back to Bezmenov, if you demoralize somebody so much and you get them so desensitized, even if you provide them all of the real evidence, all of the real proof, even if you take them to the gulags and you show it to them, they are so brainwashed by 3 generations of radical leftist education that they won't believe it until the boot stamps on them and crushes them. And that's the real sad part. Unless we wake up, it will be too late. So thankfully, it seems like the United States has started waking up with the victory of Trump. We've seen Viktor Orban, although I don't agree with him many things in terms of Europe. He is definitely right-wing and kind of pro-people, pro-family, etc. And we're seeing Javier Milei, who's phenomenal in Argentina. So it does seem that many people have started rejecting a lot of the lunacy, but the fact that it was enabled and allowed to control our education system, to control our media, to control our social media for so long is scary. And we may be lucky that we survived this kind of by the skin of our teeth. Is that the term?
Listen,
Yeah.
and I would add that anyone who's ever read 1984, George Orwell's 1984,
It's kind of ironic, the year of that video being 1984, isn't it?
and there are similarities, right? Basically how they're subverting and changing the way people are thinking. But if either reading the book or watching the movie version of it, towards the very end, sorry, I'm gonna spoiler alert, here you go. We have the main character in the movie essentially pinned down and being asked what 2 + 2 is. And the expected answer is 5. And he finally acquiesces and says, it's 5. And the guy holding him down looks at him and says, that's not good enough. I don't want you to say that it's 5 because that's what we want you to say. We want you to believe that it's 5. And that's the difference. It's not even just going along with the narrative. It's somehow believing in something. There's a belief that if you repeat a falsehood often enough, that it might seem to become true, right? And I think when you talk about things like that, even racism and so forth, if people are educated and brought up a certain way and told certain things as a child through adulthood, they've been damaged or stained as to how they're thinking because that's the way they've been taught. And that is an excuse, but it's a painful reminder that people can be twisted and turned into how they look at the world. And these are things we have to be aware of. And I think that's why education and at all levels should encourage free thought and speech. I think there should be debate if someone has a point of view that others are not in agreement with. But the minute that we start grossly limiting the way people can think about things can lead to all kinds of really bad consequences.
So let's go ahead and watch this video of Chinese propaganda behind the trade tariffs.
This is one of many floating around TikTok. Here you go.
And suppliers behind Lululemon, some of their yoga wears are actually from Xianglong Clothing and Politician Clothing. And guess what? both factories located here. And these two factories also supply clothing for Fila and Under Armour. I guess most of you know the price of Lululemon for other big brands. They sell you in legging pants for $100. And guess what? Here in these two factories, you can get them for around $5 to $6. Crazy. And what's even better? The material and the craftsmanship are basically the same because they all come the same production line. This is why people come to China and looking for the OEM factory because they just can get the cheapest and best quality product from there.
Yeah, to be honest, it seems if you're buying, there are videos, similar videos for Hermes bags and Gucci bags and stuff like that. I think at least the high-end Hermes stuff, those are supposedly handmade in France, and it seems more likely that they're handmade in France than mass-made in Chinese factories, just because the attention to detail and the quality of the stuff. But when you do talk about more basic clothing wear, like Lululemon pants, there's, like we saw Mr. Wonderful mention in his Senate hearing, there is a very high chance that the same factory that's producing Lululemon at the moment during the day, at nighttime, will produce a copy of Lululemon. So basically the same production line, same material, same quality to be sold as a knockoff. So that is something we're seeing a lot, unfortunately, out of China. And it could theoretically work to the benefit of Americans, as we have in the upcoming video.
Yeah, I think that, again, like everything in life, there might be a kernel of truth, right? But the narrative or the argument that they're trying to portray is, hey, you don't need the United States. We make everything here, and the United States has no value, no consequence. China runs the show. And that's not a fair representation of what's going on. Also, that they were given the opportunity to do manufacturing, that's great, but that means they're not going to be able to get to the next big product that's going to be launched, because that's being led by an American company that, now with all of this going on, might not opt to have the production line being tended to in China. It's like, I think it's comical in a way. They're shooting themselves in the foot, but I can't blame them for trying. Yeah, this next video definitely gives a perspective, maybe a little more of a perspective in and around how U.S. companies do business with the manufacturing end in China. Go get this pulled up now.
Chinese producers are all over social media right now, and they're exposing just who is targeted by Trump's tariffs. And it's not the American consumers, and it's not the Chinese producers. It's actually our international corporation who have sold out American prosperity for their own profits. Let me illustrate. Let's use this example at Nike. Now, these are fictitious numbers, just for example. But let's say that Nike buys shoes from this company that manufactures Nike shoes for $10 a Nike shoe, which isn't very far off. Nike turns around and sells that shoe at retail for $100. Here's the interesting part about tariffs. You're not paying tariffs on the retail price. This is not a tax in the classic sense. The way the economists who are bought and paid for are trying to conflate it as, it is a tax on the import. This means with a 25% tariff, Nike's going to have to pay $2.50 to the US government every time it imports a Nike shoe at $10. So this $2.50 gets remitted to the American government, to American citizens. Now Nike's cost $10 for the shoe, $2.50 for the import tax. This means they're netting $87 per shoe. Now that's net, not profit. There are going to be other costs that are going to have to come from that. But you can see that the increase in cost is $2.50. So let's say that Nike passes the entire cost onto the consumer, even a little more, just because of the fear of tariffs. $103 a shoe now. That is the impact of a 25% tariff. So what the Chinese producers on TikTok are saying, instead of the American consumer buying it for $103, or let's just say that the company Nike eats all $2.50 of the tariff and still sells it for $100, you're way better off over here, paying directly to China, including the tariff, $12.50 a shoe plus shipping. So as you can see, the tariffs are not meant to hurt consumers. They're not meant to hurt China. They don't really affect China at all. They're meant to protect American industry. They're meant to protect Americans from their corporations who will sell them out for a profit. So if you look hard, you'll notice that the people who are screaming about how bad tariffs are for consumers, it's these companies right here. It's Wall Street. It's all the investors in these companies, because they don't want American citizens to realize these companies have sold them out. and that they're not doing Americans any favors.
Yeah, so I think this is very interesting because I think it'll be surprising to a few people, a few aspects of this. First of all, people assume, and the way many times legacy media will portray it, is that if an item costs $100 and there's a 20% tariff, you will be paying $120. When in reality, the tariff is always on the import. And if the import is only costing Nike $10, then it would be $12, right? So that itself is one thing. Whereas, wait, we thought that these tariffs are going to raise prices by $20. In reality, it'll raise prices by $2. That's much easier for one side or another to swallow. The other aspect, and there is, so it's a mixed bag. These international corporations, it's true, they've basically sold us out and they rip us off, right? The same exact product. Anybody who's familiar with kind of gray market items on a lot of e-commerce websites, what companies will do is they will use gray market. So if you import Panasonic computers or phones or whatever, Panasonic printers, let's say, or screens to the United States from Japan, then you have to do it through the United States importer for Panasonic items, and you're going to have to pay United States prices. What a lot of companies will do is they will purchase items from Namibia or Kenya or somewhere else very cheap. And because Panasonic knows that they can't sell the same product at the same price that they do to American consumers, to European consumers, let alone to African consumers, right? So the price in Africa is way cheaper, sometimes a third or a fifth of the price. And then the gray market sellers will go and take the authentic Panasonic item, bring it to the United States and sell it at the United States for a discounted price and a profit. It is true that, and we've even seen this with like medicine, where, you know, the same pill that in the United States will cost you $100 in Japan or Israel or Germany will cost $10, and in Egypt will sell for $2, and the manufacturer is selling it for a profit at $2, but they still sell it at $100 in America because they can, because Medicare and Medicaid will pay for it, etc. It is true that a lot of these big brand names are screwing over American people. The counter argument to that, and what we've seen back to the hearing of Mr. Wonderful, was a lot of what these companies are doing are stealing American intellectual property. Now, how much of this intellectual property is really brilliant innovation, right? When we're talking about tech that's much more popular, we're talking about a piece of Lululemon pants, probably not that much, even if theoretically Lululemon has 12 million patents. The fact is that it's not real intellectual property that they're stealing. So I think there is some differentiation to be made, because many times what they're doing is stealing American intellectual property. And obviously, if they're using the emblem, the symbol of the company legally, that's straight up a theft or plagiarism.
Well, IP theft. They're basically stealing the brand. They're stealing the technology that was in place to make that for that company. But they do that all the time, so that's not a big shocker. But thanks to the Gentry Givers Instagram channel and Luke David Johnson for that explanation, because ultimately it's important to look at the different sides to all of this, right? Don't you agree?
Yeah, definitely.
And
yeah, so like we said, there's a lot of the companies stealing American people, but then there's a lot of like genuine research. Does Nike do research and development? Yes, they definitely do. And do they discover new materials, new processes, ways to build and develop stuff? They do also, right? So the fact that the factories, they should have some right to some of that profit, but it is also true that they gouge and don't treat American people equally, because if they can sell it, let's say profitably for $15 in Africa, then they should be able to sell it profitably for $15 in the United States. And the fact that they can bill people $100 for it, capitalism is what people are willing to pay for it. So as long as people are willing to put up with it, then this will continue. But if people now have an option to just go to Alibaba and purchase it directly, and again, if they're stealing American intellectual property, that's not fine. But for really basic stuff like sweatpants or whatever, then it can save Americans a lot of money, basically cutting out the middleman who's been taking the vast majority of the profits along the way. Because we all know that the factory workers in China don't make anything and are treated like slaves. The factory owners can be very rich, but still they're not the ones taking the majority of the profits. That typically goes to the American international brands. And yes, they have many costs, but also it's not always fair. So just an interesting food for thought.
yeah, and arguably China's being capitalistic as a country, trying to wheel and deal and do what it can do. And one of the things we were also in our discussions before starting this episode had to do with the massive takeover of land in the United States. But oddly, some of the locations are in interesting locales. They're not all beachfront properties.
Surprisingly, yeah.
Yeah, let me put that.
China likes to buy a lot of farming land, but when you monitor the locations of where those tend to be, It does seem ironic. And the fact that we're allowing other countries to purchase our very, very good land. So the United States has some of the most, something like a nutrient dense land in the world, some of the best farmland on planet Earth. And the fact that we're just letting other nations just take it and then theoretically control our food supply is a little frightening. But this clip from Dr. Phil is very interesting.
Yeah, so the food supply would just be part of the interest. This is from Dr. Phil Primetime, and he's asking President Trump basically on this land acquisition that's keeps happening and growing across the United States, but he points out where they're strategically buying the land. Let's play that.
The red is where Chinese government has funded buying major farmland.
Yeah.
And then superimposed on that are some of our most strategic military bases.
Yeah, so the fact that many of our nuke and our ICBM intercontinental ballistic missile launch sites and many other very valuable military sites happen to randomly be very close to the farmland that China happens to randomly purchase is a very unique coincidence. And like we saw, China has been waging an economic war on the United States, an intellectual war on the United States, a cultural war, at least communism has, a cultural war on the United States and its allies. And here, this seems like very realistic military war. Obviously, it's not a war, but it seems like laying the ground for something. Even if it's just intel gathering, etc., setting up sensors. Who would notice a sensor in the middle of a corn farm field? And what if it can monitor every plane that takes off, every test launch of a missile, the cars or the people that come and go from different facilities? Yeah. I think it's very
Certainly concerning, and I think that's not an appropriate place. Maybe we should encourage them to look at some other properties instead.
Maybe they shouldn't be controlling U.S. farmland, period. Maybe Americans should control at least the ability to feed America. That's crucial.
I know some ranchers and farmers, and I can tell you they would agree. It's become a real problem. That's a whole other discussion. Large corporations taking over family farms, but that wasn't enough. Now we have on these multi-generation farming operations that are being essentially lost. And if that wasn't enough now to recognize that foreign countries, China in this case, are coming in, the companies from those countries backed by their government to do whatever is necessary for them to acquire land in the United States. Very important pieces of land that we really should have control of for strategic reasons, for national security reasons. So again, maybe a talk for another day, but definitely a concern, and it all ties in. It's not just a trade war. That's why you have to look at the bigger picture. It isn't just that we're imposing tariffs on another country because we are concerned about the price of a specific good or how much we can export to that country. These things are all part of a much bigger picture, and I just think it's important for us to keep that in mind when we sometimes see the headlines or the legacy media screaming about something that they may not be explaining all the aspects of it. And just like one of these recent stories now that's all over the news, we obviously know that the border crossings along the southern border and northern border of Canada, but certainly the southern border have basically stopped. There's almost no one crossing now since the new administration, President Trump, has gotten in. And ultimately, I lived 11 years on the U.S.-Mexico border, and I can tell you wasn't being reported by the media as to what was happening there. It was crazy. I actually saw someone drowning in the Rio Grande trying to get across. It was just horrible. We talked earlier about slave trade, and that's alive and well with a lot of the people coming over owing a debt to the cartels that got them over. And there were a lot of unaccompanied minors, tens of thousands, if not more, that have vanished. We don't know where they are in the United States, got handed off from one agency to another, and we've lost track of them. And it's very concerning as to what likely is happening to these kids. That's just the reality of what happens at the border, what happens when we aren't careful with the operation of our country. And ultimately now, of course, there's a much more stringent position with regards to illegal immigration, and specifically to those who are known drug cartel members or gang members. And we have one guy out of Maryland that's, yes, a father and has been taken away from his family, and there's such a big to-do about it. And it's interesting how the media doesn't often portray the whole picture. They're talking about a father who's been taken from his family and needs to be brought back. We've been following this, and it just, again, we would wish that in these discussions that they would be completely transparent and open about all the aspects of this particular case. And just like a lot of things in the media, they focus on one case. This is the one right now. And it's
not even a very justified case for them to focus on. Let's just say that.
Yeah, it's odd. We have a few clips that we would want to share with our audience. So I think I'll cue the first one up. It's just, I think some of these clips will help put this in perspective for anyone that's not been really following really the case. The first one is from Fox News. I'm going to bring that one up and we can play it here. Here you go.
How do you respond to these Democratic lawmakers, including Van Hollen, who say they're going to now ask for a meeting with the president there in El Salvador? They're going to travel there and demand his release.
Good luck with that. Carol Levin's exactly right. Every time I read a story about this, it's Maryland father, Maryland father. They don't mention he's a member of MS-13, who is a designated terrorist group, one of the most violent gangs in the world. They don't mention he's an MS-13 member. They don't mention he's an El Salvadoran citizen being held by the country of El Salvador. El Salvador makes that decision. Now the court said we got to facilitate. We'll facilitate, but El Salvador has full authority on this. Again, a terrorist threat. Now, if somehow he comes back and that happens, he's going to be detained and removed again. He's an MS-13 gang member based on our intelligence and El Salvador's intelligence. He will be detained and he will be deported. But what's the sense of bringing someone back to simply go and face deportation again? He's a public safety threat. He's a gang member. He's a designated terrorist. We should not be bringing any of those people back to the United States. That's my opinion.
Not to mention, he's just illegal. That was Tom Holland, the border czar. But these people were here illegally and committed crimes and were caught in the association of other known terrorists with, I think, Trenda Aragua. And he was convicted of beating his wife. And he or some of the other people who were in the car with him were caught murdering people from the state of the senator. And the senator is so caring, so emotional that he literally flew all the way to El Salvador to try and bring this illegal back illegally into the United States.
That's Senator Chris Van Hollen. We'll actually get to a clip of that. Again, I thought this first clip was helpful in setting the stage. And that was brought to us by the Libs of TikTok, I believe, Instagram channel. They did a pretty good job of taking note of that. Very well put together a panel with Fox News. But there's so much information. In fact, every time it seems that someone tries to point out that the gentleman who was, using the term loosely, who was deported, basically sent to CICOT, the ultra high security penitentiary in El Salvador, anyone that tries to point out that he's a known MS-13 either gang member or affiliated with the gang or connected in some way enough that both law enforcement and various courts have decided he can't be here. The bottom line is he was removed from the United States, and everyone's saying they want him back. The question is, back for what? Only to be redeported to another country? And they keep referring
El Salvador as he's from El Salvador. Like, where else?
In the country, right? He's in the country that he holds his nationality with. And there was an order from a judge at the time, years ago, that said the one place not to send him was El Salvador, but it had to do with the fact that at the time it was believed he was going to be going back and re-energizing himself with the gang he was affiliated with over there. So it's being taken out of context. But every time someone tries to voice this, many news stations, many networks just basically hide the entire mention of the fact that this particular person wasn't an altar boy waiting to go in for Sunday service. There's a next clip is actually from MSNBC, and it actually was a pleasant thing. Mehmet Oz, Dr. Oz, was being confirmed for his new role that he's going to help lead Medicare and Medicaid here in the United States, and he was being confirmed. And of course, at some point, a question came up and it was brought up in response by President Trump that the person that has been removed from the United States has quite a checkered past. Look what happens, and look what this particular network does when that's mentioned. That's what I think is interesting. You would think news organizations are there to report the news, good, bad, and indifferent. Let me just play that.
In 2019, Garcia was issued a deportation order. 2 separate judges affirmed Garcia was a member of MS-13, which is a gang that may be even worse.
We've been watching President Donald Trump there swearing in the new administrator of the CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid, Dr. Mehmet Oz, during this conversation.
Deflection. If anybody watched the White House event of when President Bukele, it was awesome, to be honest. When he came to the White House and when he was meeting with Trump, a deranged CNN reporter asked a very similar question. And Trump, it's just a masterclass of a takedown, because Trump basically goes from minister and just lets them just take it down. Anybody who hasn't watched it should definitely watch it. It is brilliant. It is about 5 minutes in length. But at the end, she, after being crushed by the fact that even the Supreme Court didn't take the side that CNN really wants to support, which is the side of the terrorists, and she turns to Bukele and says, "Will you please bring him back?" And Bukele, "Are you crazy? You want me to illegally smuggle an illegal person into the United States who is a criminal, who faces deportation?" So he shuts her down completely. And this is after Stephen Miller and all the rest of the White House staff, they're really just tore into her, because the question is so ridiculous. And this kind of gets back to a point that in the Middle East, we've noticed for a very long time. And that is that legacy media and many times the court systems support the terrorists. There's no other way of putting it or understanding it, but they always end up taking the side of the terrorists, and as opposed to their victims. And it is ironic, it is disgusting, but it is something we've seen time and time again, is that the mainstream media cares so much for the way the Nukba terrorists that raped and murdered Israelis on the 7th of October are treated are in Israeli prisons. Back 10 or 15 years ago, there was a time period when everybody was so worried about the diet of the terrorists in Israeli prisons. Now, just to understand, in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, many of these people grow up eating a pita bread and some hummus on a regular basis, and that's a good meal. But the United Nations and the EU were so worried that aside from Israel having a professional chef team, cooking team, prepare food for the inmates, they also had, the EU was so worried about them that they had their own chefs preparing their own 3-course dishes for these terrorists. And then the UN also sponsored their own chefs. So the prisoners can basically choose from 3 different menus which food they wanted. Thankfully, after October 7th, this is no longer the situation, and most of these terrorists are now treated the way these gangsters are treated in CICAR, in the maximum security prison in El Salvador, which is, don't make their life nice. When somebody grew up eating stale bread and hummus every single day, and then going to jail means you get to eat luxurious 3-star restaurants, these European countries would ship in chefs, like French professional chefs, to prepare food for terrorists, designated terrorists. Somebody who walked in the forest, saw a woman hiking and raped her and stabbed her to death, saw a professor taking a stroll on the morning on his way to give a class in university and just beat him and stabbed him and tortured him to death. Like, these are the people the Europeans were so worried about. The courts were so worried about. The newspapers, the news agencies were so caring for, that it elevated their quality of life drastically. And then Israel had a philosophy of saying, maybe if we educate these people, they will stop being terrorists, so they could get free university degrees while in Israeli prison. So basically, you get free university degrees, you get three meals a day where you get to choose which menu you like from professional European chefs, and the Palestinian Authority, using United Nations money, using American funding, using European funding, will pay the salary of every single terrorist based on how many murders, how many Jews they injure or murder. The more Jews they injure or murder, the longer their sentences, the more their family gets paid for their heroic act. So if you grew up and you have no positive outlook for life because you live in a place where Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, has been, who won the election for 4 years, and he's been ruling for the past 20 and is extremely corrupt, no matter who you ask, everybody agrees that he's extremely corrupt. He's worth billions of dollars now. So if you've got no prospect, but if you just take a kitchen knife and you go and you stab a Jewish child, your family will be taken care of. They'll get a salary for the rest of their life. A school in your neighborhood will be renamed after you. The roundabout near your house will be renamed after you. They'll put a statue up there for you. you'll spend time in Israeli prison. The longer you get in Israeli prison, the more money your family will get, and you get a better quality of life in Israeli prison than your current standard of life. Why would you not be a terrorist? This is like avoiding the entire social and religious aspects of why people take up terrorism, right? But it's just absurd, the situation. What we're seeing here of these news anchors fawning over this terrorist, right? Who objectively is just a horrible guy, who objectively was in the United States illegally, right? Just caring for him so much and trying to hide the fact that anybody tries to criticize or anybody's mentioning anything negative about him is just really dirty. And it's one of the reasons why legacy media has lost all credibility.
Yeah, what you're describing is the same MO of gangs, various gangs throughout the world. In Mexico, it's like that. You do what you're asked. I can tell you some stories, maybe on another episode, of things that were recounted to me firsthand as to how drug cartels in Mexico would recruit and why they would encourage them, and why they even kids that otherwise had never committed a crime and were good kids would get involved and could never and couldn't leave. Okay, once you're in, kind of thing. It's very tragic. And ultimately, people are swept into some of these organizations and wind up being part of that ideology. The sad part, as you're saying, is how it's reported. And we have here a clip, very short clip from MSNBC, Senator Elizabeth Warren, the Democrat from Massachusetts, via the Western Lensman X channel, who thought of catching this and sharing it with the world, and we're going to reshare it, just to show how absolutely insane you can take a situation where you have someone that is been taken out of the country, has lost all rights to be here, is not a citizen of the United States, is back in their country, is in jail there. If you want to go and lobby for them to do something different with them in that country, that's fine. But there's no real basis for us to have our elected officials traveling around the world to somehow do that. I'm sure they have their own elected officials there to do it. Regardless, here's just, I couldn't have made this up. I couldn't believe that someone would actually say what she's about to say. I think let's listen to it and then we can talk some more.
Yeah, let's watch Pocahontas.
We do not disappear people in the United States. Because here's the thing. If they can disappear Mr. Abrego Garcia, then they can disappear you. It's about disappearing people, but it's also about obeying court orders. But now what we've got is truly a man who threatened yet a spineless bunch of Republicans in the House and Senate who help it along. And the American people think, wait a minute, I think this is the moment we're going to have to start fighting back for our country.
Yes, Pocahontas, why don't you start caring about all the tax dollars that somehow you disappeared of, allegedly?
It's mind-boggling, okay? Just that she is spending this much effort to advance such a narrative. It's very hard to, and again, people hear this and figure, oh, it's so horrible. This person has been, how did she call it? Disappeared. And that they're coming for you now. We better watch out. They're going to come for all of us.
No. Maybe if you're an illegal alien who's a criminal, then maybe she is, and maybe that is a good thing.
Involved with not just gang activity, but MS-13 it's a ruthless, again, if anyone follows, and that's another thing too. A lot of this isn't really well publicized, okay, as to what crazy, horrific things are done by these organizations. When I was living on the Mexican border, at the time I was there, it was quite common that minutes across the Rio Grande from where I was living, people were being hung from
overpasses.
People were being beheaded. It was, most people in the United States didn't know, they never saw or heard of that. And unless you were living in an area like that, you had no idea either. It took me literally several years of living there to just accept that's what was going on in Mexico. I kept asking myself, isn't the government there going to do something to stop it? Silly me. What's the U.S. doing to stop it? And so forth. And ultimately, it was just hard to fathom that people living just minutes from where I was living across the border were living in fear of having, not just being killed, but being severely tortured before being killed. So it was quite a thing. And then you have people like Senator Chris Van Hollen, who again is taking on this big cause. I'm not completely sure how he feels it's going to help all of his constituents, but he feels that this one man who's been deported is his constituent as well, and he's going to go and fight to the end, and ultimately has traveled to go meet with the president of El Salvador, to meet with the people from the prison, to see what he can do. And again, if he can make the living situation in the prison there better for this one individual, again, I think that's an admirable cause. I just don't understand how you can do that with the false narrative that it's just some random American who's been sent away for no good reason. That's the issue I have. If he wants to be Mother Teresa and go over there and try to help a fellow human being, despite what that person, atrocities they may have done or may have been connected to other people who did, that's a whole other conversation. It just, you don't expect your elected officials to be spending their time and energy to travel like that for someone like this.
Yeah, ironically, supposedly some of his own constituents were murdered by the same gangs of this terrorist, MS-13 and Tren Aragua and stuff like that. And I think he never even went to visit the families of the bereaved who were suffering from the outcome of the actions. Instead, he flew to internationally to try and free, against the will of the president of El Salvador, to try and act to free this supposed terrorist. So, yeah, if they only cared about their constituents as much as they cared about the illegal alien criminals who were acting in their states, then maybe their states would be better places to live in, and less people would be leaving them for Texas and Florida and other more conservative-leaning states.
I would say that's another very important point, that a lot of the media just completely ignores the story of the victims. They look at these stories and they talk only about how sad it is that the person that's connected to bad things, that they've been asked and required to leave the country, whereas what bad things happened here. In fact, this deported individual, who again is not a U.S. citizen and has no legal basis to be in the United States, if he returns, he's only going to be deported again. The thing people forget is this is not a good person. He was arrested. He had orders already for having beaten his wife in the past, I think at least on a couple of occasions. So all that being said, this is not a pleasant thing to be discussing. It's just shocking. It's not good all around. The guy's a father, a spouse. You don't want him being separated from his family regardless, but that he is, you have to put it in context. Let's hear what Senator Hollen has to say about his visit to El Salvador.
We just tried to go visit him in prison just to check on his conditions. Is he doing okay? Because nobody has any communication with him since he was illegally abducted from Maryland and sent to CCOT prison in El Salvador, which is a U.S. District Court judge said was a violation of all his due process rights. Today's purpose was just to see what his health condition is. And these soldiers were ordered to prevent us from going any farther from this spot. I understand we're about 3 kilometers now from CCOT. And as you can see, they're letting other cars go by, but they stopped us because they're under orders not to allow us to proceed to check on well-being of Gilmar Abrego.
The amount of care that they have for criminals, for cartel members, and for terrorists is just astonishing. If they had a tenth of that level of care for their own constituents, their own people, the victims who've suffered in the hands of these terrorists, then the world would be a much better place. But some people are just morally corrupt, like we saw Bezmenov very clearly lay out. When you have 3 generations of brainwashed people, no matter how much truth you slap in their faces, they will just continue to be brainwashed until the boot comes and crushes them themselves.
Yeah, it's hard to watch. It doesn't make sense given the full understanding of what's going on. I think that's one of the things that people that are looking at this are shaking their heads going, how could they be spending so much time and effort trying to help someone who is certainly suspected to be very connected to MS-13, at the very least doesn't have status in the United States, And ultimately, what about all the other things going on here? What about protecting the communities here? So it just seems very concerning. The next clip that I think we discussed sharing, I think talks a little more about that particular side of things, how it maybe helps bring it full circle and to explain that the way that we look at things maybe need to take in consideration the needs of the people living here that are U.S. citizens and are legally here and that aren't connected to gang activity.
Violent criminals.
Yeah. This is a clip from Fox Business. Let me play that next.
There's a lot of places in the United States that would like to see an official delegation of Democrat congressional members like their own districts. Cities like Los Angeles and Detroit still, certainly Baltimore, the nature of what's happening in New York. My goodness, San Francisco still. These are people who've abandoned their own neighborhoods, their own districts to policies that destroy lives every day. And the person at issue here, an alleged MS-13 gang member, is not a United States citizen. He's an El Salvadoran citizen. And they were also complaining about money, about the nature of us facilitating some of the costs to imprison these criminals, gang members, general misanthropes, back, repatriating them back to their own countries to be able to be imprisoned or housed, whatever those countries are going to determine to do with them, that they're complaining about the cost when they want to fly congressional members to that country to have press conferences. This is the absurdity that Americans have been facing for too long. Americans deserve representation, safe cities, the ability for their children to be safe at home, for their daughters to come home alive. It is outrageous, the concern we see for alleged gang members or men who are domestic violence perpetrators who are here illegally, who are not citizens of this nation. And that is the focus of the Democratic Party when Americans every day, and this is why Trump is the president, is because they want things to be different and to be better. And that is going to be brought by the Trump administration. So the Democrats, we see every day what their priorities are, and it's not the American people.
And so the hope is that the American people have enough memory to last another year and a half and remember these corrupt congressmen and state representatives and boot them out of office, not let them be reelected. Obviously, just go out and vote against them, and hopefully they will be replaced. But like we said, theoretically, in some of these districts, some of these people may have some really radical supporters who are in until death with these state representatives, no matter how much they act in the service of illegal criminal aliens, violent aliens, as opposed to their own constituents. Do we have a happy ending to get to?
Yeah, we have a few things. Next thing would be basically just a quick snippet in trying to understand what do people really think about all these deportations? What is the position on this? And
from our favorite CNN pollster.
Yep. So what is CNN reporting as far as what's the sentiment now in the United States regarding all these deportations, not just this case in particular, but in general? And I think it's very, very telling. Let's put that up.
Deport all undocumented immigrants. Voters favoring the government trying to deport all 11 million of them. Back in 2016, just 38% of voters wanted the government to try to deport all 11 million undocumented immigrants. Compared to where we are in 2025, 56%, the majority. The American people have come a long way on this issue, much closer to Donald Trump. And I think that's a big part of the reason why Americans are increasingly saying the country is on the right track when it comes to immigration policy, and why Donald Trump's net approval rating on that issue is in the positive.
Yeah, it's just interesting to watch, especially when you see the CNN co-host's face where she's basically crying. She's so mad and angry and frustrated at the fact that Americans care about America. I think one of the reasons why MAGA was so hated, and again, I was not a member of MAGA in any way, shape, or form, but I was surprised by the amount of hatred that they faced. I think the people who hate MAGA don't just hate because they think that Trump is far-right, extremist, Nazi, etc. Maybe some of them, the deluded ones. Some of them have been so influenced, so demoralized, like Bezmenov said, that they don't want to see America great again. They don't. They want to see America fail. And they voted politicians who will act in order to make America fail. So I think the war now is between civilization. People want to continue to build and grow and thrive and make this country greater than it's ever been. And yes, there are issues. Yes, there are problems. Everything can and will be fixed, hopefully, versus people who all they want to do is tear it down and create and destruction and depression, who believe that there is no fix for the evils of the past aside from creating new evils of the current. We are definitely not subscribers to that. And was that our last video on the subject?
On the subject, yes. And I think as we wrap things up, it's always good to have some humor. As I always say, laughter is the best medicine. And why not call on our friends at the Babylon Bee to put some perspective on some of the worldly situations that are going on. The first is just one of the posts that they actually have. Do you see what it's
American hostages in Gaza disguise themselves as MS-13 gang members, so Democrats will fly to bring them home. We'll fight to bring them home.
We'll fly over there to arrange for their release, because there's obviously the sarcasm and humor is basically saying that we have a coalition of Democratic politicians who are looking to get together and all fly to El Salvador to bring home this one alleged MS-13 gang member. Perhaps if the people being held in captivity were MS-13 gang members, they would get the same similar level of attention. We keep perhaps not seeing this on the news anymore, but before we know it, October is going to be coming again, and we still have hostages that are being held in just absolutely deplorable, that's not even a strong enough word, conditions. And the hope is that they're still alive and hanging on there. But through satire and Babylon Bee's typical commentary, what they're basically saying is, hey, maybe we need to focus the attention and energy and resources to bring some folks home who really do need to be brought home. And I think that ultimately that's an important thing. And it's important for us to be reminded of it, even if through a sort of slapstick sort of humor. But in the same extreme realm, there's this other clip that we stumbled upon that kind of sums things up sometimes when it comes to it's better to laugh than to cry. And let's just say it's some people's perspective on the United States and our democratic republic. And perhaps given some of the politicians we have and some of the things they do and say, it doesn't surprise me that there are people around the world that might view us in this light. So this is a very quick clip. I don't agree.
I think it's funny. There's a kernel of truth, like most things that
yes, I don't agree with the commentary outright, but it does maybe help paint a picture as to why sometimes other countries look at us a certain way. And here we go.
Because democracy basically means government by the people, of the people, for the people. But the people are retarded.
Yeah, that is just so good. The delivery is just so good. It is just hysterical. And again, there is a kernel of truth, like we were saying. When your representatives care more about terrorists than they care about their own constituents, then yes, maybe it is a government of the people, by the people, for the people, but they aren't for the people.
But the question is what people?
Exactly.
Okay.
Let's hope it's not the retarded people.
I think this brings us to an end of episode 6. And I think we covered a lot of ground. And look, hopefully there was enough for our listeners to find reason to research more and educate themselves more on all these topics, and to agree or disagree with us, but at least to continue the conversation
Or
on
down
all
in the
these
comments.
Please comment. Go ahead. We're here to hear the feedback, and we want you to be part of the community.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody, for joining, and we'll see you guys again in episode 7. Thank you, Joe.
Bye, Yo. Bye, everyone.
Have a great night.